I'm Padma Raghavan from Penn State, and it's my pleasure to introduce two excellent speakers who are also my valued colleagues. The first speaker in our session today is Dr. Victoria Stodden. Dr. Stodden is a professor in the School of Information Sciences in the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she also has an appointment at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Her research concerns the problem of enabling reproducibility in computational science. This includes studying adequacy and robustness in replicated results, designing and implementing validation systems, developing standards of openness for data and code sharing, and resolving legal and policy barriers to disseminating reproducible research. She's the co-chair of the Advisory Committee for the National Science Foundation's Advanced Cyber Infrastructure Division, and she's also a member of the NSF SCIC Directorate's Advisory Committee. Victoria, her talk will be on reproducibility in high-performance computing.
Great. Thank you so much, Padma. And it's a real pleasure to be here and interacting with this audience. What I'd like to do today in my few minutes is spend some time unpacking the notion of reproducibility. I think probably if I asked everyone in the audience what they thought reproducibility was or what problems it posed in their research, I would get n different answers. So I think it's important to try to get a common framework in how we start thinking about and dealing with issues in reproducibility. So I'm going to pull it apart into three categories: empirical reproducibility, computational reproducibility, and statistical reproducibility, and spend the bulk of my time on the computational aspects. So that's the agenda for the talk. So we've all probably seen these headlines and how reproducibility has started to capture not just the scientific community, but it's actually in the popular press. And you can go to airport lounges or cocktail parties and talk about your work as a computational scientist, and people who aren't in the field or aren't in the area or aren't scientists will start asking you about reproducibility issues and integrity in science. In 2013, remember The Economist put a special issue on how science goes wrong, talking about reproducibility issues. There's been myriad editorials and advocacy and discussion in journals like Science and Nature, and you can see them. You can see the LA Times. Science has lost its way at a big cost to humanity. So I'm setting the stage and trying to give you this sense that there's a lot of discussion going on, and the discussion is many different groups, and there's a plurality of issues that are coming to the fore around reproducibility. So unpacking this concept, as I mentioned, empirical reproducibility, computational reproducibility, statistical reproducibility, I'll go through and explain these in terms and how I think that remedies can attach differently to each of these different conceptions of reproducibility. Okay, empirical reproducibility. Much of the discussion that we saw on the sort of press flash of headlines around reproducibility, I think falls in the category of empirical reproducibility. Many scientists, when you mention reproducibility issues, will think of a researcher at, say, a wet lab bench and actually physically reproducing those experiments. So how have they adjusted the settings on their devices, for example, and how have they actually constructed the assays, and what have they actually done in terms of the experimental design? And people think of this frequently when you mention issues of reproducibility. So I put two examples here just to illustrate. So the first one, there was an article in Cell Reports in the commentary sorting out the facts, the devil in the details. I put this up here because this was, I think, an instructive illustration of empirical reproducibility. Two labs, one at Harvard and one at Berkeley, had a joint grant to work together. They had allocated 2 months at the beginning of the grant to reconcile their approaches in the labs that produced the cell assays. And they wanted there to be no signature difference where you could identify which lab the results had come from. And that seems reasonable. It took them 2 years to try and determine how their processes differed, and there were all sorts of assumptions and tacit knowledge made about how you actually conduct the science that people didn't think to question, and they had to dig into all the details of the research. It turned out one lab stirred a beaker, another lab put it in a centrifuge. And that made a signature difference. And so that would be an example of empirical reproducibility in carrying out science. On the right, I mention a National Academies roundtable from last year, which was very interesting. It was focused on reproducibility, the missing R, reproducibility in a changing research landscape. One of the issues that came up there, these are people who work in labs primarily doing experiments on mice and live animals. So what does reproducibility mean in the context of where you actually kill animals to reproduce an experiment, for example? So those are issues that start to attend to what I'm calling this notion of empirical reproducibility. I won't spend too much time on the empirical aspects. I think the computational reproducibility is more relevant to this audience, and it is also the subject of my research. So I started trying to think, what's an intellectual frame I could use to understand notions of reproducibility or irreproducibility in computational science? And I'm thinking of computational science as anywhere where you're using a computer in your discovery process or pipeline. I have a focus in this talk, of course, on high-performance computing, but really many of these issues transcend the different types of ways that computing interacts with discovery. So traditionally, we've had two branches of the scientific method. Our first branch, deductive reasoning, mathematics, formal logic. Of course, that falls short when you want to do something like predict when to plant your crops and when the river's going to be flooding or something like this. So we have a second branch, empirical research, or the inductive branch of the scientific method. So here we have statistical analyses of controlled experiments. So everyone in this room has heard the discussion around a third branch of the scientific method, around simulation, around computation. Fourth branch of the scientific method, the data deluge and data-driven discovery. In fact, these are such entrenched concepts now that even just clicking around for a few minutes on the web, I found this 1995 website from NIST about a modeling and simulation workshop where I pulled out the text. Even though this is probably the first talk that I've given where you can actually read the text, I didn't need to pull it out. But the text on the, right on the first page in 1995, it is common now to consider computation as a third branch of science, besides theory and experiment. Okay, so this is common in 1995. On the other side, this is the cover of a book. Again, I'm just grabbing examples that just seem to pop up. There's nothing particularly special about these examples. But this book was published in 2009, The Fourth Paradigm, an edited volume by Microsoft. And right in the preface, it says, this book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. So there's all this sort of seeming intellectual architecture around how computers are being used in scientific discovery, but I'd like to push on that a little bit more. And I just wanted to mention that my slides are on my website. If you prefer to kind of look at them on your laptop, you can, and many things are hot linked in here, so feel free to just grab them directly from the website. Okay, the impact of technology. So clearly, the discussion of the third branch of the scientific method, fourth branch of the scientific method are being driven by the technological changes. I found it useful to pull these apart. So it's not just that we're swimming in data, we're swimming in different types of data. So we're confronted with data, for example, many more variables and observations, new types of analysis are needed. The data deluge is not simply an issue of scale. Secondly, I don't need to tell anyone, I don't think in this audience about the power of simulation as a tool for discovery and understanding of our universe, posing new questions, and finding out new things through simulation, particularly of the physical world. The reason I leave this slide in here is for the third point, which I think is equally as important as the first two, which is the pervasive use of software now as a tool and a necessity in scientific discovery. So now we have intellectual contributions embedded only in the software, real scientific contributions. I'm a statistician, and we develop methods, and often the actual implementation of the methods, even though it may be described in a paper and published, is really appearing in the software. And I argue that this is happening everywhere and over. So we've got parts of the scientific record, scholarly contributions that are now appearing only in code. So I put a picture of Lior Pachter here, who is a professor at Berkeley. I just grabbed a screenshot from YouTube, and he's talking about in this talk, he goes, the software contains ideas that enable biology. And he doesn't mean, and so do the papers, which they do, but unique ideas are in the software. Okay, so if we go back to the discussion about the scientific method with this backdrop of technological changes, thinking about why we have a scientific method and the problems that it's supposed to solve is really a recognition that error is everywhere and everything we do is fraught with error. So this is our starting point. We propose new findings or new discoveries to the community, and we try to convince others we've done everything we can to root error out of that discovery process. So in the deductive branch, they have a well-defined notion of the proof. You wouldn't consider publishing a mathematical result without actually giving the proof. In the empirical branch, there's an entire machinery of hypothesis testing, appropriate use of statistical methods, and a very structured way that you deliver those methods to the larger community. If you try to publish and leave the methods section blank, journals will just out and out reject you and ask you to fill it in. And it's this notion of transparency or being able to really root error out of every stage of the process. So here's the claim that I submit to you. Computation, this discussion of third branch of the scientific method, fourth branch of the scientific method, this is only potential branches until we as a community develop comparable standards as the first and second branch. So what's our notion as computational scientists of the proof of the claim? What's our notion of appropriate dissemination standards for computational science, for example? And it's not meant as a criticism. These branches have had hundreds of years to come up with their appropriate standards. We've had 20, maybe, and we're just starting to wrap our minds around this issue. So my advisor was David Donahoe at Stanford, and he was inspired by another Stanford professor, John Claerbout, who invented the notion, or the term, really reproducible research. So as a graduate student, we would share our code, share our data every time we published. And there's a paraphrase of this idea of really reproducible research, and I know it's written there, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. So the idea of really reproducible research is that an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete set of instructions and data that generated the figures. So this is starting to drive at a definition of reproducibility. For the purposes of computational reproducibility, I'm considering our baseline to be, can I, in some sense, run your code using your data or producing your data and get your output and your results that are the claimed findings. So this is sort of our baseline notion of reproducibility. In many fields and across the computational sciences, it might be instructive to consider a second notion of reproducibility. Can I independently re-implement your experiment and get similar results? So one question that I'll preempt that people often ask me is, well, who cares if I can run your code and get your figures? That hasn't advanced science at all. What's really important is that independent implementation. Then I can do something like say I've confirmed the results or I've refuted the results. And I think that's absolutely true. The difference is when I implement your experiment independently, I'm guaranteed to get different results for a myriad reasons that all of you can conjure. How do I actually do that diff between what the original researcher did and what the independent implementation did if I can't actually just baseline run the code or get access to actually what was done? And so we need to reconcile the differences and have that deeper level of transparency than just independently re-implementing the experiments on the systems. Okay, so I'm not the only one who's noticed this issue. There are a number of workshops and activities that have been happening in the community that I wanted to bring your attention to. So I was one of the co-organizers of this workshop at the end of 2012 at ICERM at Brown University, Reproducibility and Computational Experimental Mathematics. A number of co-organizers are here at Supercomputing 15 as well. The reason I mention this is we took a week and we discussed these issues, and it actually resulted in a workshop report around issues. And I encourage you to look at it. It's here, setting the default to reproducible. This idea that code goes open, data goes open, these other scholarly objects that are needed to reproduce the computational science are made openly available, just like the publication. And then if they're not available, that's exceptions to our normal mode of functioning. So we had a couple of publications in Notices of the AMS and in SciAm News just announcing the workshop report. And I'm going to put a very busy slide up, but it's not necessary to read the whole thing. I'll pull out the pieces that are important. One of the things we tried to do was think about what would criteria be for inclusion of information in a publication that would make it reproducible. Like, what did you really need to know to assess the reliability and veracity of the published findings? So we went through some definitions. Do you have assertions? Do you have the computational approach? Are you citing software? Are you talking about what hardware was used? I've done some research to see how well people comply with this. Almost no one talks about their hardware implementation. Details of your analysis. What have you done for data filtering? How have you prepared it for analysis? What parameters did you use? Did you actually tell us what they were, the parameter settings? Is your code available? What functions did you call, and in what order? Have the functions been modified since your publication? Computational instructions. Is there a sense of a workflow? Can I go through and make the same function calls you did, with the same parameter settings, on the same data? Is that even possible, and can I do that? Let alone what system I'm actually running it on. Did you tell me what you, as the reader, what you tried and didn't work? These sort of failed avenues of exploration. This also can be very important for assessing the significance of findings, for example. Okay, so that's that's a teaser. That's one of the exciting pieces in the ICERM report, and we discussed quite a bit of these issues in depth. In 2014, so a couple of years later, there was a workshop prepended on Exceed 14 in the summer, Reproducibility at Exceed, and I'm assuming the audience is familiar with the Exceed platform. It can provide an interface for users who want to use more HPC resources and find an interface useful in order to do that. And so the idea was in our workshop, well, maybe that's a place to think about how to implement reproducibility if there's already management of the jobs that are being submitted, for example, in the software and the tools. So we had a workshop, and there's actually a final report now and a number of submissions to the workshop and an enormous amount of interest in how we start to step towards reproducibility. And I'm posing reproducibility in a sort of binary sense, like can I run all your code and get your results? But bear in mind that incremental pieces or being able to expose parts of that workflow and parts of the pipeline as we go through is also extremely valuable. It's not really an all or nothing, even though I'm sort of presenting it that way. Again, I'm not the only one who's noticed there's a problem. There's a number of tools that are appearing, and more every year. Like, this is a hopelessly incomplete list. I can't keep up with it. And most of these tools to try and help the problem of reproducibility are just coming from faculty members who are doing it on their spare time because they're concerned there's a problem. I think there's maybe Gene Pattern was a collaboration with Microsoft, and there's a couple of pieces that are working with industry, but the vast majority here are just concerned faculty members putting stuff together, trying to solve the problem. These are hot linked. I encourage you to take my slide deck and click on some of these. Some of them are just phenomenal in terms of what they can do. Like, for example, IPOL will rerun image processing algorithms. You submit the image, run the algorithm. Chameleon also stepping towards reproducibility, particularly in HPC research. So they basically, as far as I could see, divided into 3 types of approaches. Dissemination platform, so post-publication, what can I do about access to code, access to data, however it's defined for your particular application. Pre-publication, is there steps that can be taken at the computational level to track workflows and what researchers have done, save those parameter settings, in some sense automate some of that reproducibility steps and make them available with sort of minimizing pain to the researcher. And then there are a collection of tools that are trying to deliver better documents in the scholarly record. So I just called those embedded publishing. So for example, instead of a flat PDF, you may have a PDF with images where you can drill in and get code or maybe execute and get to the data and so on. So they'll have these aspects of reproducibility built into the image itself. Okay. All right, so I've been working on Research Compendia and as a demo to try and explore these ideas that I just outlined and how well they work within actual application contexts. And this one I would call a dissemination platform. So the idea of Research Compendia is we have one static web page that's persistent, that links out to the paper. So we don't, unless it's an open access journal, we don't try to host the paper, but it could link out to, say, arXiv, for example. And then that's where code and data can be accessed or made available. And the idea is being able to recognize contributions, say from programmers or database managers that might not be, they may be authors on the paper, they might not be, but we can recognize the code and the data and the other scholarly objects on this page. And you can see here, I have little buttons to download code, download paper. This happens to be an open access article, so we can download the paper. So the idea here is really, I mean, I'm not saying this is a solution, but I'm saying let's prototype a few ideas and start testing them out. Can I make permanent links between code, data, and a publication in the scholarly record? So we do assign DOIs, for example, to code data to the Compendia page and try to link these objects together. Okay, so we can run it too. So maybe we can do third-party, if I've got your code and I've got your data, maybe I can do third-party independent verification that at least I can get your figures in the paper. Not to say this is scientifically correct, but I can at least say, well, yeah, I got what they published. And then it starts to open these ideas about, well, maybe I can run that code on other data sets, or maybe I can put data sets together and make an even more powerful study, for example. And it starts to open these new avenues of considering what we would do with the scholarly record if it's not a static object and it's got these other decorations on it, like data, like software, for example, that are extraordinarily powerful. All right. It's all open source, so if you're interested, you can just grab it and stand it up if you would like. And I just will mention as a teaser for what will come up in a few minutes in my discussion that we are putting our code under the MIT license. There are a number of licenses that I consider to be suitable for the scientific community, very lightweight licenses that encourage the attribution but really don't place further restrictions on reuse. Okay, so many of these ideas are mentioned in my book. There's actually, if you click here, it's all downloadable. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you need to buy it, but there are discussions of tools, practices and guidelines, and platforms. I was a co-editor on this book, and we have many talented authors who have really gone in depth in some of the implementations of how they think about reproducibility in their computational environment. Okay, so I wanted to mention a couple of studies. So some of this, and I mentioned how Research Compendia is really a tool to try and understand what works and what doesn't work in sharing in different communities. One of the things I did is I was interested in the machine learning community and wanted to see sharing behaviors, and so I just decided to study NIPS. And I asked NIPS authors if they had shared the code or data with their latest NIPS paper, and if they had, why, and if they hadn't, why. And there's a paper about this that I don't have any time to go into, so I'll just jump straight to the punchline. So for people who did share code and did share data, why were they doing this? Predominantly, you see reasons that are about the larger community and about building a type of environment in which to do science. So you see things like encouraging scientific advancement, encouraging sharing in others, being a good community member, setting a standard for the field, which we start to see. There's maybe a little self-interest because if you set a standard, you pick up a zillion citations. So that's a reason to share. Improving the caliber of research, getting others to work on the problem, publicizing your problem, getting feedback on your problem, finding collaborators. Okay, so those were the top reasons. And when people did not share their code or share their data, why? The first reason here, one of the respondents said it's so important, it's on a log scale compared to the other reasons. Time to document and clean up. It's hard to get the code documented to the point where another person might use it, same with data. And why would I spend the time on that if I'm not rewarded for it? So that really, to me, speaks to an incentives problem. I've actually never met a researcher that loved that part of writing up the results into a paper. They all do it. And it's similar this with code and with data, that if we don't have incentives there, we don't have good citation practices, for example, and how we actually reuse code and data and reward people for sharing, then it simply becomes this burden that people are unwilling to engage in. So that was the number one reason. The second one, I'm not an IT person. I can't deal with all the questions I'm going to get from the users. I gave a talk once where someone told me they shared some code in the 80s, and they're still getting questions about how it won't install on the system and so on. So these are real concerns. Not receiving attribution. So some people will use my work, and I'll have put the time into preparing code and data, making it available, and I won't get any credit for this. Possibility of patents and legal barriers like copyright. So this was much higher on the list than what I anticipated, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to licensing. I need to verify with the administration that I can actually release this data. Potential loss of future publications. So notice how far down getting scooped is actually on the list. And the empirical evidence is for when people share the software or share the data associated with their publication. Generally speaking, they're not scooped, their next idea. What happens is people come in on some orthogonal research tangent, use the data in ways that no one anticipated, and then if the system was working well, the original releaser would pick up citations for all of this and get the reward for sharing. I don't want to advantage my competitors. I don't even know where to put the stuff. I don't have enough space for it. OK, I also wanted to mention a little more about legal aspects of sharing code. So this is just, I think this is probably a version of the document that I signed when I became a student at Stanford. And everyone in an academic institution has signed a similar version of the agreement saying that your inventions are going to be the property of the university. And depending on the institution may make decisions about whether or not to patent them. Maybe that's up to the researcher or not. And however, you are supposed to be reporting all of these inventions. And the academic institution will lay claim to this. And that's, I'll postpone the reasons for that because it's coming up later in the talk. However, I do see this coming clash with how we deal with ownership of codes, patenting, and reproducibility, availability, and transparency. OK, so let me talk a little bit about some of the legal barriers. So copyright is probably one of the main legal barriers to sharing software and also to some degree sharing data. So I'll just mention it very quickly. First of all, it's right in the Constitution. Promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. OK, so that sounds like our best interests are right in there. Copyright has evolved through Congress and through many different copyright acts. And what it means today, original expression of ideas falls under copyright by default. You don't have to register your copyright. Your original idea, however you've expressed it, for example, in software, falls under copyright automatically. And what does that do? It means you, as the author, is the only one who can reproduce the work legally, and you're the only one who can prepare derivative works based on the original. So, i.e., build on the work, citing the original, not allowed under copyright. Unless, of course, you get permission from the original author. So I would have to email you and say, is it OK for me to take your code, run it on my data, for example. There are some exceptions to this, for example, fair use, but they don't cover all of what we would do in science with software and with our data. So this is a photo of Richard Stallman, and he noticed issues around copyright and code many, many years ago. And what he did, he invented the solution of open licensing, actually, and wrote the first open license, the GPL, the GNU Public License, as a pre-permissioning rider that would go with software. So you could just say in advance, here's the terms of use that I'm going to let you use this software under, and you didn't have to actually email him to ask. So since his innovation, which many people credit with actually protecting and allowing the open software community to flourish, there's been hundreds and hundreds of licenses that people have come up with for the different terms of use for software. So a very successful step. So this is a picture of Larry Lessig, and he was inspired by Stallman and created with two others the Creative Commons organization. And what Creative Commons does is it says, okay, so Stallman's open source licensing solution applied only to software, but what if, say, you're an artist and you'd like to share an image or a figure or movie, MP3, whatever it is, how do you pre-permission this? You can't really use the software licenses to do that. So at Creative Commons, they adapted this approach through 4 main licensing types for artistic works. So then the question that I had was, well, what about the scientific community? We're sharing code, but we're not only sharing code, we're sharing data, we're sharing things like images, and what could be called artistic works. We have our publications and figures and tables and so on. And so that's the idea behind the reproducible research standard for the scientific community, is how can we use the licensing to match the norms that we have in the scientific community about sharing and about reuse. And the way that I understand those norms is we have scientific discoveries, put them out in the scientific community for evaluation, skepticism, criticism, reuse, hopefully extending our body of scientific knowledge so others can build on them. But we do want attribution and citation through that. But otherwise, we're not adding extra encumbrances to the reuse of this information. So our media components could go under a Creative Commons attribution license to match these norms. Code components under the MIT license we saw earlier for Research Compendia or modified VSD license, essentially saying reuse my code however you like, but I want attribution when you do that. And then releasing the data into the public domain or possibly attaching an attribution license. Data I'll get to in one moment has a little bit of complicated aspects to it. So the idea is remove that barrier that copyright was posing on reproducible research, realign this IP framework for the sharing of these digital scholarly objects with our long-standing scientific norms. Okay, so with data, there's no copyright on raw facts in the US. There is copyright in Europe, for example, so we have international meshing issues with ownership of data. In the US, the original selection and arrangement of these raw facts is copyrightable. So my questions are, what counts as a raw fact? What counts as original selection and arrangement? There is no case law on this, so this is up to us to interpret. And so there is this possibility of some residual selection and arrangement, some copyright attaching to data, so that's why I advocate putting it into the public domain to just not worry about any potential copyright issues that may attach to the data. Okay, so I mentioned earlier what I think is a coming conflict between sharing code and institutional or university incentives around patenting that are often researcher incentives around patenting as well. This stems from the Bayh-Dole Act, which was passed in 1980. This is the act that gives the institutions the right to claim ownership over the inventions and use the patent system to generate revenue and also expose the research to the larger community, particularly in industry. This was passed in 1980. So I'm 99.9% sure none of the Congress people who were doing this were thinking about code or thinking about the computational environment that was to come. They were thinking about things like drug development, which is still most of where Bayh-Dole actually has its impact. Increasingly, though, it's starting to affect software and algorithm patenting, for example. And I think we need to be cognizant of how this interacts with transparency and reliability in the software that we're developing for research and publishing as part of the scholarly record. So disclosure of research codes, I feel that we would, as a community, march towards an open disclosure of research codes. Some cases are certainly more difficult than others. However, we need to be mindful of the impact of Bayh-Dole and the incentive to patent on how we actually do this. One thing that I'm promoting is this notion of dual licensing, so perhaps we have a sort of patenting track for industry, and for the research community, we have this open availability track. Okay, so this is another issue where people in the scientific community are starting to think about code and code sharing, setting the default to reproducibility, to reproducible, top 10 reasons not to share your code and why you should anyway, best practices for scientific computing, for example. So there's this discussion is starting to come up from the grassroots level. One of the discussions points that I hear frequently, talking to journal editors, talking to funding agencies, is that the scientific community must lead. We can't sit back and wait for the funding agency to say your requirements in the grant around data sharing or around code sharing are this. Your requirements to publish in the journal mean that you disclosed your code this. I'll get to some research that I've done on that in a moment. There are steps from the journal and the funding agency level. However, it really is up to us as a community to start taking these steps and saying that we want this to be part of how we carry out science, this full disclosure of the reasoning. Okay, so I carried out a study on journals. I was interested in how journals are responding to code sharing, data sharing pressures. I didn't have particularly high hopes for the results simply because of the editorial board structure, and I thought having to come to this type of agreement on code access or data access might be more difficult than if it was just one person making the decision. So I chose 170 journals. I took ISI classifications, statistics and probability, mathematical and computational biology, and multidisciplinary sciences. So I had Nature and Science, and there are some very high impact journals in the sample. And we gathered a huge amount of information from the journals. Again, I won't have time to go into all these, the details of the study. However, they are available. I have a reference for it. So we just looked at what are the requirements on publications in the journals in June of 2011 and June of 2012. So we get a sense of how things are changing too. So for data sharing, the requirements kind of fell into 5 bins. Required as a condition of publication, barring exceptions. Exceptions would be things like you have human subjects data you can't legally share and things and so on. We require the availability of data. However, we might publish your stuff anyway. There's another bin. Many journals had language talking about, sort of encouraging authors to do this, but they stopped short of a requirement. And then there's language that implies that you should be doing this. And then, of course, there are journals that just ignored the whole issue. So the upshot of this chart is that we went from about 67% of the journals in my sample, the 170 journals, not mentioning code and data at all in 1 year, down to about 62.5%. So we're seeing this march, and we're seeing this march, I think, I don't want to overread the numbers, but towards requirements around data availability from the journals. So the amount of activity here actually surprised me, and I thought we would see less, but they've actually been quite active in taking steps. I did the same thing for code. So what are requirements around code sharing and data sharing? Much less, this issue has been addressed at a far lower level than for data. So you can see 3.5%, and actually that 3.5%, those are software journals. So they actually are in there publishing the software anyway. But you do see small changes like this encouragement going from 10% to about 12%, and journals ignoring it going from about 83% down to about 79%. So you sort of see it trending the same way towards this openness and transparency. So who's doing the changes? Who are the journals that are agitating? They're your high impact factor journals, the ones that are more comfortable asking for more from their authors. Lower impact factor journals are just happy to get authors at all. Supplemental materials, if your journal has a supplemental materials policy, very likely it has a data access policy. I was interested also if the journal was open access. Was it more progressive around data and code disclosure? The answer is no relationship at all. It seems like 2 different discussions. Journal open access just seems to be sort of a different set of considerations as opposed to code and data availability. And data supplemental materials policy seem way ahead of the discussion on code. And if you just think about what you've heard in your community in these policy discussions, probably you've heard things about open data being discussed at various levels. things from the White House, things from, say, NSF, for example, or DOE. Less have we heard the discussions around software. And I think if we had that framing of reproducibility, we could have discussions around data needed to reproduce and understand results, which isn't the discussion we're having now. And also code would be just as important in that discussion and discussed just as much because it's part of reproducibility of these workflows. And we could have a discussion around a more sort of scoped part of the research that we do. I wanted to just also call out, so Mike Haru is not actually in this audience, although he's here. He had a conflict. But ACM Tom's Transactions on Mathematical Software, which has been around since the 60s, by the way, recently had an editorial saying they're going to implement what they're calling this RCR, Replicated Computational Results. So they will provide independent confirmation that results contained in a manuscript are correct and replicated. So similar to the research compendia idea. This is all available on the website, too. Successful completion of the RCR process gives the manuscript a replicated computational results designation on the first page of the published article. There are other journals that have done similar things. The journal Biostatistics for years has had a reproducibility editor. If your work happens to be in R, reproducibility editor will run it, and they'll also kite mark with a big R on the front of your page if they can rerun your results. So steps being taken in the various aspects of the community. Just to close the loop on my different aspects or different lenses of reproducibility, I wanted to mention statistical reproducibility, even though it's not a focus of this talk. Lots of issues around statistical inference that could cause results not to generalize. Like, for example, are you running lots of tests and lots of models, cherry-picking results, using the p-value at the wrong threshold, for example, to make results look more significant than they might otherwise. This is incredibly common, this multiple testing problem. Designing experiments with low power and not checking the power, you wouldn't expect those to generalize, yet there are lots of experiments that get done that way with poor experimental design. All of this stuff that I mentioned in the ICERM report around what have you done in terms of data preprocessing rarely gets out into the community as part of the publication. So what have you done in terms of treatment of outliers, merging data sets, what decisions were made, did you keep observations, throw out observations, how did you match them, how did you impute missing values, for example, what algorithms did you use, what parameter settings. All of that can dramatically change inference from the data. So it's imperative that we know all these small details of these decisions that were being made, and it's very difficult to get that out of publications. All the usual candidates in terms of statistical methods problems, non-random sampling, inappropriate tests, and so on. Thinking about if we have perturbations in the underlying data, is our model stable to this, or does our model kind of react wildly? You might think a more stable model would be more desirable. And then there's this consideration of science always taking place in this human context. We always have investigator bias, our favorite hypotheses. If we match or support previous results, we are more likely to get published than if we're trying to overturn them and so on. So we have this sort of human element in all of the discussion that I'm making today. I wanted to just mention in Science at the beginning of last year, they have new policies within the context of statistical reproducibility. They're requiring now a data handling plan meant to address things like how outliers are being dealt with, giving sample size estimation for effect size, trying to address some of these power issues, whether samples are treated randomly, whether the experimenter was blind to the conduct of the experiment, or could they kind of bring that human element in? And they added statisticians to the board of reviewing editors. Okay. So my final slide, thinking about how we can update reproducibility, recognizing that there's a failure of our traditional reporting methods, and we need to adapt our standards to encompass this notion of third branch of the scientific method, fourth branch of the scientific method around computing and around data. Benchmarking, testing, we don't see, generally speaking, a lot of this in the computational work. I think one of the solutions will start to incorporate notions of testing and software and understanding reliability in scientific discovery. And I wanted to just mention, which has been a subtext through the whole talk, that we are facing a collective action problem. So who solves this? Do individual researchers solve it? Ones who are coming up for tenure and they're expected to put in all this extra work? Journals, does the requirement on publication supposed to solve this? Or requirements associated with grants and funding agencies supposed to solve this problem? Universities, how do we actually start to bring together all these stakeholders and have this larger discussion about what needs to be done and what's reasonable to be done? Okay, so I also wanted to mention I'm hiring a postdoc, so if you know anyone good, it's a joint with the NCSA at Illinois, so the information's on my website. The upshot is basically just email me. And this slide was on the sort of SC15 blog post advertising the talk, in that we're not facing a trivial problem here. So this is log of the lines of code that have been submitted to ACM TOMS since 1960 up to, I think, 2013. And we have this incredible linear increase on a log scale. So we're not dealing with a small problem. We're dealing with huge amounts of software and a huge amount of effort and a first-class object in terms of the scientific discovery process. Okay, I'll leave you with this slide. Lots of activity going on around reproducibility next year at SC16, and so I'll leave you to take a look at that. But this is an ongoing conversation, and I'm very pleased to present some of these views to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we have time for one question. There are two mics here on either side of the stage. Could you please come up and, yes. And you could line up, please.
Helmar Burkhardt, Basel, Switzerland. We had an exciting BOF yesterday on this issue, and I had experts of HPC, of supercomputing, in my panel, and they were rather critical on that issue. They said there are too many parameters that influence the performance. One put it up to the formula, there are fans, that it makes a difference about the fan speed on the temperature on the performance. We cannot control the fan, so repro does not work. What would you answer to such an extreme position?
Yeah, so there are lots of problems, and my talk was necessarily somewhat abstract and high level. But as we dig in, there's going to be issues. So, and also, this is not the only community facing these issues. At that conference, the National Academies conference dealing with mice, for example, there was a study recently that the gender of the handler of the mice will influence mouse reactions differentially, and no one had paid attention to the gender of the mouse. This was now an omitted variable, and so they needed to. All their studies came into question. So things like, can we actually capture machine state, or can we capture parameter settings? There are folks who are working on automating this, so even the large number wouldn't be a challenge. However, it's early days, and we're thinking about this. And even different pieces, if we can even get different pieces of that pipeline reproducible, even if there are challenges that take more time to solve, I still think that's an advancement for generalizability and for reproducibility. But I never said it was easy.
I also tried in my introduction yesterday to introduce the different levels, that it makes a difference between repetition or replication or reproduce. But they more or less, my experts, they ignored this and put everything into this repro.
Yeah.
How many levels do you think? Are 3 enough, or is it too much, or too many, or what do you think?
I think it's very application dependent. The two that I described in the talk today around can I just run code, even that one has all sorts of embedded levels in it when you start pulling it back. And I think that's a larger discussion, but it very much depends on the application, what hardware system you're using, what types of complexity in the software that you have. And so I try to just keep it framed as, can I actually run things and get to your result, or can I just even sort of independently reproduce your result? And those are the two sort of bins that I think it's useful to put these in. But it's very application driven.
I think we have one more question. Perhaps we can take that while our next speaker is getting set up.
Great talk, Victoria. I see a potential challenge. When we look at code, we look at different programming languages, and not everybody is a programmer. And when I look at data, I see different type of data, so we need some sort of metadata. Shall we reconsider? Shall we teach programming to everybody? Yes, we wish, but it's not feasible. How can we reconcile code in different language, manuscripts, data in different types?
Yeah,
what kind of approach?
It's
do
a
you
really
suggest?
good question. I don't have an easy solution for that one either. I think that the data question is probably easier in different formats, translating data between. When I started with the project that I didn't get a chance to talk about, the Run My Code project, one of the first questions we got is, oh, you can run the code on the data. It would be really great if you could return, Stata code in R. Then that would really help the scientific community. It's quite a challenging problem. So it's not one that we chose to grab, but I think that's also a coming challenge. How do we reconcile different codes? Or how do we deal with legacy systems that have been built in particular codes, and you just sort of have to learn them to work with those systems. Yeah, industry faces the same problem as well.
Let's thank Victoria again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.